Psychologically, this is where it gets interesting. Avoidants are not devoid of emotion, they are protectors of it. They suppress, they distance, they intellectualize, but they still feel. The difference is they only allow those feelings to surface when they feel safe from expectation. The moment they sense that someone needs something from them emotionally, they retreat. But when you remove that need, when you became emotionally self-sufficient, you stopped triggering their defense system. And suddenly, you became someone they could move toward instead of away from. Think about that shift. Before, your energy might have said, do you care about me? Do I matter to you? Even if you never said it out loud, that energy was there. And they felt it. Now your energy says something completely different. It says, I value myself. I don't need you to complete me. I choose you, but I don't depend on you. That is magnetic. Because now, instead of feeling like they have to give something, they start to wonder what they're missing. And the human mind is wired in a very specific way we don't chase what is guaranteed. We chase what feels uncertain but valuable. When you were seeking validation, you were, in a sense, lowering your perceived value in their internal world. Not because you lacked worth, but because you were signaling dependence. When you removed that signal, your value didn't just increase, it became ambiguous. And ambiguity creates intrigue. Now they start asking questions they never asked before. Why aren't they reacting the way they used to? Why don't they need me? The same way, have I underestimated them? And most importantly, am I losing them? That last question is where emotional activation begins for an avoidant. You see, they don't respond to pursuit the way most people do. They respond to the possibility of loss. Not loss in a manipulative sense, but the realization that someone they took for granted is no longer emotionally anchored to them. And here's the deeper philosophical layer. When you stop needing validation from someone else, you're not longer negotiating your self-worth externally. You're no longer asking another human being to tell you who you are. That's not just attractive, that's transformative. Because now, your presence is no longer a request. It's an offering. And people feel the difference. An avoidant especially feels the difference. Because for the first time, they are interacting with someone who isn't trying to pull something out of them, fix them, or define the connection prematurely. They are simply experiencing you. And in that experience, emotions begin to rise slowly, quietly, but powerfully. Not because you forced them, but because you gave them the one thing they rarely encounter: emotional freedom. And when someone associates you with freedom instead of pressure, they don't run. They lean in. So what looked like you pulling away was actually you stepping into your power. What felt like silence was actually clarity. What seemed like distance was, in reality, emotional independence. And that independence is what made them feel something they couldn't ignore. Because the moment you no longer needed their validation is the moment they started seeking yours. And once that shift begins once, you're no longer seeking validation. The next thing that quietly transforms everything is your emotional self-control. Because most people don't realize this, but emotional reactions are the language of insecurity. The moment you react impulsively, whether it's frustration, over-explaining, chasing, after a delayed response, you are unconsciously signaling that your internal state is being controlled by someone else's behavior. And with an avoidant, that signal doesn't create closeness. It creates distance. But you did something different. You stopped reacting in real time. You created space between what you felt and how you responded. Now that doesn't mean you became cold or indifferent. It means you became intentional. You allowed emotions to pass through you without immediately turning them into action. And that level of restraint is rare. Think about the psychological impact of that. An avoidant is used to patterns. They expect escalation. They expect emotional pressure when they pull away. They expect the other person to lean in harder, ask more questions, demand clarity. And when that pattern shows up, it reinforces their belief that closeness leads to overwhelm. But you broke that pattern. When they pulled back, you didn't chase. When they were inconsistent, you didn't interrogate. When there was silence, you didn't fill it with anxiety-driven communication. Instead, you remained grounded, present, centered. And that did something profound. It disrupted their predictive model of relationships. Because now they couldn't categorize you the way they categorized everyone else. You became emotionally stable in a way that felt unfamiliar. And here's the paradox. What is unfamiliar becomes intriguing. Your calmness wasn't just about composure, it became a form of quiet power. It communicated without words that you are not easily shaken, that your emotional state is self-governed, that you don't collapse under uncertainty. And that matters more than most people think. Because avoidants are constantly scanning for emotional risk, not consciously, but instinctively. They're asking, will this person overwhelm me? Will they demand more than I can give? Will I lose myself in this connection? And when they sense volatility, they withdraw to protect their autonomy. But when they encounter someone who is emotionally regulated, something shifts. They feel safer. Not because you told them you're safe, but because your behavior proved it. And safety for an avoidant is the gateway to emotional access. Now let's go deeper for a moment. Emotional self-control is not suppression. It's not pretending you don't feel. It's the ability to experience emotion without being dominated by it. It's the discipline to choose your response rather than defaulting to reaction. That distinction is everything, because when you operate from reaction, you are predictable. And when you are predictable in that way, you become easy to manage, easy to distance from, easy to dismiss. But when you operate from control, real control, not forced detachments, you become grounded in a way that demands respect. And respect is a precursor to attraction. So now, instead of seeing you as someone they need to manage emotionally, they start to see you as someone they can't easily read. Someone who doesn't bend under pressure. Someone who holds their center regardless of what's happening externally. That creates tension. And tension, when it's not chaotic but contained, becomes magnetic. They start wondering what you're thinking. They start noticing your silence. They start interpreting your calm as depth rather than disinterest. And slowly, without you forcing anything, their attention begins to shift towards you in a more focused, more intentional way. Because you know, longer reacting to them, you're responding from yourself. And that's a completely different energy. It says, I am here, but I am not controlled by this moment. It says, I feel, but I don't lose myself in what I feel. It says, you don't get access to my reactions, you get access to my presence. And presence, when it's rooted in self-control, is incredibly powerful. Because most people are driven by impulse. Most people are governed by emotion in the moment. Very few people have the discipline to pause, to process, and to respond with clarity. When you become that person, you don't just stand out, you become unforgettable. And for an avoidant, that kind of energy doesn't trigger escape. It invites curiosity. It invites engagement. It slowly lowers their guard because they're no longer bracing for emotional impact. They're experiencing emotional steadiness. And that steadiness becomes the very thing they didn't know they needed. So understand this. Your emotional self-control was never about playing it cool or pretending not to care. It was about reclaiming authorship over your internal world. It was about refusing to let external inconsistency dictate your inner stability. And the moment you did that, you stopped being someone who reacts to love and became someone who defines it. Now here's where most people completely misunderstand attraction, especially with someone who leans avoidant. They think closeness is built through more effort, more messages, more explanations, more presence, more emotional intensity. But in reality, emotional pressure doesn't create intimacy. It collapses it. What actually creates movement in an avoidant dynamic is space. And this is where you change the entire emotional field without even realizing the full depth of it. You stopped filling every silence. You stopped trying to resolve every pause instantly. You stopped treating distance like a problem that needed immediate fixing. Instead, you allowed space to exist, and that decision on. The surface, it looks like doing less. But psychologically, it's doing something far more powerful. It's allowing the other person's emotional system to breathe. Because when someone is avoidant, closeness can feel like pressure, even when it's well-intentioned. Too many messages, too many emotional check-ins, too many attempts to define the relationship, too quickly it all compresses their internal sense of autonomy. And when autonomy feels threatened, their instinct is to pull back. But when you remove that pressure, something unexpected happens. They don't disappear. They think, they feel, they notice. Space creates room for emotional processing. And avoidants, more than most people, need time to process feelings without being forced to articulate them in real time. So when you stop filling every gap with pursuit or explanation, you unintentionally gave them something they rarely experience in relationships' emotional breathing room without consequence. And here's the deeper truth. Space is not absence. Space is invitation without demand. It says, I am here, but I am not chasing you. It says, I care, but I will not collapse into anxiety when you step back. It says, you are free to move closer, but I will not force closeness to happen. That changes everything. Because now, instead of feeling pursued, they feel something far more psychologically complex. They feel the absence of pressure. And the human mind reacts very strongly to contrast. If someone is used to emotional intensity and suddenly experiences calm distance, the brain doesn't interpret that as rejection. It interprets it as curiosity. What changed? Why did the dynamic shift? Are they okay without me? And most importantly, why do I feel more drawn in now that they are not pulling me in? That's the paradox of space. It doesn't push people away, it pulls them inward through reflection. And in your case, that space wasn't passive. It was intentional energy management. You didn't disappear emotionally, you simply stopped overcrowding the connection with urgency. You allowed moments to breathe instead of forcing constant meaning into them. And that breathing room created something very important in an avoidant mind. Safety through non-containment. Because what they fear most is being emotionally trapped. But when they realize you are not trapping them, when they realize they can come and go without being punished, chased, or emotionally cornered, they begin to relax. And relaxation is the first step toward emotional engagement. But there's another layer most people miss. When you create space, you are also creating contrast. And attraction is deeply dependent on contrast. Without space, presence loses meaning. Without silence, words lose weight. Without distance, connection becomes background noise. So when you step back, emotionally not in bitterness, not in manipulation, but in grounded self-respect, you allowed your presence to regain significance. Now when you showed up, it mattered more. Now when you spoke, it landed deeper. Now when you engaged, it wasn't expected, it was valued. Because scarcity of pressure creates richness and experience. And here's the philosophical truth beneath all of this. Real connection cannot survive suffocation. It only survives freedom. And most people confuse freedom with distance, when in reality, freedom is the absence of emotional coercion. You didn't abandon the connection. You purified it. You removed the urgency that was clouding it. You removed the emotional noise that was making it hard to feel anything clearly. And what remained was something more subtle, more uncertain, and far more emotionally engaging. Because now they had to meet you in space, not in pressure. And in that space, something starts to happen that you cannot force and cannot fake. They begin to feel you when you are not even actively there. That is the real power of space. Not that it removes you from their life, but that it leaves. Your presence echoing in their mind without forcing it. And when someone starts to feel your absence more than your pursuit, that is when the emotional dynamic quietly shifts in your favor. Because you are no longer the one pushing for connection. You are the one they notice in the silence. Now let's talk about the moment your entire identity inside the relationship started to change when you became independently unpredictable. Because this is where things shift from emotional adjustment to psychological redefinition. Most people in an avoidant dynamic unknowingly build their life around the other person. Their availability becomes predictable. Their attention becomes scheduled. Their emotional presence becomes centered around one source. And even when it's not intentional, it creates a pattern the other person can rely on. And predictability, while it feels safe on the surface, slowly kills curiosity. But you broke that pattern. You stop being available on demand, not an A. Performative way, not in a manipulative way, but in a natural return to your own life. Your attention wasn't always instantly accessible. Your energy wasn't always waiting in the same place. Your priorities expanded beyond the relationship. And that did something very important psychologically. It disrupted their expectation of you. Because human beings don't just attach to people, we attach to patterns. We become comfortable with the way someone behaves, responds, shows up. And once that pattern is established, it becomes invisible in a way. It stops being questioned. It becomes assumed. So when your pattern changed, even subtly, it forced awareness back into the dynamic. Now they had to reevaluate you. Not because you became different in essence, but because you stopped being fully predictable in form. And unpredictability, when it is grounded and not chaotic, creates attention. Let's be clear about something important here. This is not about playing games or creating confusion. It is about reclaiming your life outside of the emotional orbit you were once stuck in. You didn't become inconsistent, you became whole again. You started doing things without announcing them. You stopped over-explaining your schedule, your mood, your availability. You didn't make your life a constant report of where your attention was going. You simply lived it. And that creates a very specific psychological effect on the other person. Because now, instead of feeling like they have full access to you, they begin to realize they don't. And that realization is powerful. It introduces uncertainty, not insecurity, but curiosity. What are they doing right now? Why are they not as accessible as before? Why do I feel like I can't quite predict them anymore? And underneath all of that is a deeper emotional shift. I'm not the center of their world anymore. Now, for an avoidant, this is particularly significant because they are often used to emotional distance in themselves, but not necessarily in others. When someone else becomes independently anchored when they are not emotionally waiting, not emotionally hovering, it creates a mirror effect. They start to see your independence reflecting their own tendencies, but without the same emotional avoidance pattern. And that contrast is compelling because you are not withdrawing out of fear. You are expanding out of self-direction. There is a massive difference between the two. Fear-based withdrawal says, I am pulling away because I feel hurt, anxious, or uncertain. Self-directed independence says, I am engaged in my own life and I am no longer organizing my existence around emotional availability. One is reactive, the other is grounded. And people can feel the difference even if they cannot articulate it. So now, instead of knowing exactly where to find you emotionally at all times, they have to pay attention. They have to re-engage mentally. They have to reconsider assumptions they had already settled into. And that re-engagement is where attraction starts to reignite. Because the brain is designed to prioritize what requires attention. But there is another layer here that is even more important. When you become independently unpredictable, you are no longer reinforcing their comfort zone. You are expanding your own. And in doing so, you communicate something without ever saying it. My life is not organized around your presence. That is not rejection. That is sovereignty. And sovereignty is deeply attractive not just to avoidance, but to any psychologically aware individual. Because it signals that you are not operating from emotional dependency. You are not waiting to be chosen in order to exist fully. You are already living fully. And connection is something that adds to your life, not something that defines it. And when someone realizes that about you, their perception shifts. You are no longer a fixed emotional constant they can assume. You become a dynamic presence they have to re-encounter each time. And that creates a subtle form of emotional engagement that is far more powerful than constant availability. Because now, every interaction carries weight again. Every moment with you is no longer routine, it is presence meeting presence. And here's the deeper truth beneath all of this. Independence is not about distance. It is about integrity of life. It is about refusing to shrink your world to fit inside someone else's emotional limitations. And when you do that, you don't lose connection, you elevate it. Because only those who can meet you in your wholeness are capable of staying in your orbit. And everyone else begins to realize they can no longer assume access to you. And that realization is where desire quietly begins to grow again. Now let's go into something that looks simple on the surface, but psychologically changes everything in how you are perceived. You stopped over-explaining yourself. Most people don't realize how much of their emotional power they give away through explanation. Every time you over-justify your feelings, your decisions, your boundaries, your silence, you are, in a subtle way, asking for permission to be who you are. And when you are dealing with someone who is emotionally avoidant, that pattern becomes even more important because over-explaining doesn't create understanding. It creates distance. You might think clarity comes from saying more, but in reality, emotional clarity often comes from saying less and meaning it more. At some point, you shifted. Instead of trying to make sure they understood every detail of your intention, every nuance of your behavior, every reason behind your boundaries, you stopped. You began to trust that what is real does not require excessive defense. And that shift changes how people relate to you. Because when someone is used to receiving long explanations, emotional negotiations, and repeated reassurance, they unconsciously start to expect access to your inner reasoning at all times. It becomes part of the dynamic. They act, you explain, they withdraw, you interpret, they question, you justify. But you interrupted that cycle. You became someone who speaks clearly once and then allows silence to carry the rest. And that silence is not emptiness. It is confidence. Let's go deeper into what's actually happening psychologically. Over-explaining is often rooted in one underlying fear. The fear of being misunderstood and therefore devalued. So people try to bridge the gap with more words, more context, more emotional labor. They believe that if they just explain enough, the other person will finally see their truth. But with avoidant individuals, this has the opposite effect. Too much explanation can feel like emotional pressure. It can feel like an unspoken demand. You must understand me correctly, or I am not okay. And that creates tension. Because now the interaction is no longer just about connection, it becomes about managing emotional interpretation. But when you stop doing that, something shifted in the dynamic. You stopped treating your worth as something that needed continuous verbal defense. You stopped trying to correct every misunderstanding immediately. You stopped filling in every gap in their perception of you. And instead, you allowed them to sit with what they already had. And that is where psychological processing begins. Because the human mind doesn't deepen understanding through constant input. It deepens understanding through space and reflection. When you over-explain, you remove the need for reflection. Everything is given. Nothing is interpreted. But when you give less, the mind starts to engage more actively. It starts to fill in gaps. It starts to form meaning. It starts to assign significance. And now, instead of you carrying the entire burden of being understood, they begin to participate in the process. But there is something even more powerful happening here. When you stop over-explaining, you are no longer negotiating your identity. You are no longer saying, let me prove why I reacted this way. Or let me justify why I need this boundary. Or let me explain why I pulled back. Instead, your energy shifts to something much more grounded. This is who I am, and I don't need to over-defend it. And that energy is felt instantly. Because people can sense when someone is trying to convince them versus when someone is simply expressing themselves. One creates tension. The other creates respect. And avoidants, in particular, are highly sensitive to emotional pressure disguised as communication. So when you stop over-explaining, they stop feeling that subtle pressure to respond, agree, or emotionally regulate you. And in that absence of pressure, something interesting happens. They begin to lean in mentally. Not because you are demanding clarity, but because you are no longer forcing it.